Imagine for a moment that everything you learned about Julius Caesar in school was just the surface of a much deeper and more disturbing truth. What if I told you that the rise of ancient Rome's most powerful man wasn't just the result of his military or political genius, but rather of secret knowledge dating back to civilizations lost more than 4,000 years ago? Knowledge so powerful that it was deliberately hidden from official history, transmitted only through secret societies and mystical rituals that still influence the world's powerful today. Today you will discover the truth behind ancient Rome's greatest mystery, a story that connects Egyptian pyramids, Babylonian temples, and the darkest secrets of power that shaped not only the Roman Empire, but all of Western civilization. Prepare for a journey that will shake everything you thought you knew about history. If you're curious to unravel these mysteries with me, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what time you're watching this video. Let's discover together how many brave souls are willing to know the truth. The story you are about to hear begins long before the birth of Julius Caesar, long before even the founding of Rome. To truly understand how an ordinary man managed to become a god among mortals, we must go back to 2000 BC, to the banks of the Nile River, where Egyptian priests guarded secrets that could transform any man into a supreme leader. The ancient Egyptians weren't just pyramid builders or pharaoh mummifiers. They were masters of a lost science, a form of knowledge that combined astronomy, mathematics, psychology, and something we would now call collective consciousness manipulation. The oldest papyri found in the secret chambers of the pyramids reference techniques for influencing crowds, methods for inspiring absolute loyalty, and rituals capable of transforming an ordinary man into a near-divine figure in the eyes of the people. This knowledge was not confined to Egypt. When Alexander the Great conquered the empire of the pharaohs in the 4th century BC, his generals and advisors had access to secret libraries containing millennia of accumulated wisdom. It is no coincidence that Alexander managed to conquer almost the entire known world. In just 13 years, he not only possessed superior armies, he mastered ancient techniques of leadership and influence that made his soldiers fanatical about his cause and his enemies incapable of resisting his charisma. When Alexander died, his generals divided the empire, but not its secrets. This knowledge was preserved and transmitted through a clandestine network of priests, philosophers, and aristocrats spread throughout the Mediterranean world. It was an invisible society, with no official name or public temples, but with immense power to influence the fate of nations. Rome, in the 2nd century BC, was a growing republic, but still a relatively young civilization compared to the ancient empires of the East. The Romans were excellent soldiers and administrators, but they lacked the mystical sophistication and esoteric knowledge that had made other peoples truly powerful. This changed when Roman armies began conquering territories that had been part of Alexander's empire. In the conquered cities of Greece, Syria, and Asia Minor, the Romans found not only treasures and slaves, they encountered learned men, philosophers, and priests who possessed extraordinary insights into human nature and the forces that govern entire societies. Some of these men were taken to Rome as prisoners, others as volunteer advisors, drawn by the prospect of influencing the emerging new world power. It was in this context that Caius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC, into a patrician family already connected to these esoteric circles. The Julia family claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, a myth that was not merely political propaganda, but a coded way of indicating that they possessed divine knowledge, that is, secret knowledge that transcended common understanding. From a young age, Caesar demonstrated exceptional intelligence, but not just in the conventional sense. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to understand exactly what motivated each individual and how to use those motivations for his own purposes. This ability was not natural. It was cultivated through specific techniques. He learned from carefully selected teachers. When Caesar was sent to Rhodes to study rhetoric with Apollonius Molon, he was officially learning the art of oratory. In reality, he was being initiated into much deeper knowledge. Apollonius was not just a teacher of speech. He was one of the last guardians of esoteric traditions dating back to the mystery temples. of antiquity. Under his guidance, Caesar learned not only how to speak in public, but how to use words, gestures, and even silences to mesmerize entire audiences. The techniques Caesar mastered included what today we might call primitive neurolinguistic programming. He knew how to use specific language patterns to bypass people's conscious minds and speak directly to their subconscious. He knew how to use rituals and symbols to create powerful emotional associations. He knew how to construct his own image so that people saw him not as an ordinary man, but as a force of nature, almost like a god incarnate. When Caesar returned to Rome, he was no longer the young aristocrat who had left. He was an initiate, someone who possessed secrets few men in history had mastered, and he immediately began putting this knowledge to use. His first public display of power occurred when he was captured by pirates. During the return voyage from Rhodes, the official story goes that he demanded that the pirates increase the ransom because he considered the initial amount insulting for someone of his standing. But the truth is more complex. Caesar used psychological techniques to completely reverse the power dynamic between himself and his captors. Within days, the pirates no longer saw him as a prisoner, but as a near mystical figure to be respected and feared. Upon his release, Caesar not only returned with a fleet to capture the pirates, as he had promised, he crucified them, but first slit their throats as an act of mercy. The seemingly contradictory gesture was calculated to create a specific impression. Caesar was ruthless with his enemies, but also possessed a divine nature that elevated him above common cruelty. News of this event spread throughout the Mediterranean, creating around Caesar an aura of supernatural power that would accompany him for the rest of his life. Back in Rome, Caesar began his political ascent, but in a completely different way than his contemporaries. While other politicians relied primarily on money, family connections, or conventional military prowess, Caesar built his power through what can only be described as mass social engineering. He understood that Rome, despite its military strength, was undergoing a profound identity crisis. The old republican religion no longer satisfied the spiritual needs of a growing, cosmopolitan population. The Roman people yearned for something greater, for a connection with the divine that their ancient traditions could no longer provide. Caesar recognized this need and set out to fill it. Drawing on knowledge dating back to the ancient Eleusinian mysteries and the secret cults of Egypt, Caesar began to present himself not only as a political leader, but also as an intermediary between the gods and the Roman people. He incorporated mystical symbols and rituals into his public appearances, always subtly, so that people could sense his power without necessarily understanding its origins. His victories in Gaul were not simply the result of superior military strategy. Caesar used psychological techniques to demoralize his enemies before battles even began. He knew how to use espionage, propaganda, and psychological warfare more sophisticatedly than any general of his time. But most importantly, he knew how to use these victories to build a myth around himself. Every battle won, every city conquered, every tribe subjugated was transformed into proof that Caesar possessed divine favor. He not only defeated enemies, he transformed them into legends that enhanced his own mythical stature. The accounts of his campaigns, carefully crafted and distributed in Rome, were not simple military reports. They were pieces of psychological propaganda designed to create in the minds of the Roman people the image of Caesar as a near supernatural being. When Caesar finally returned to Rome with his legions, he was no longer seen as a successful general, but as a force of nature, as someone chosen by the gods to transform Rome's destiny. The famous episode of crossing the Rubicon was not a moment of impulsive decision. It was the carefully orchestrated culmination of years of psychological preparation. The phrase "alia iacta" state, "the dice have been cast," was not simply an expression about taking risks. It was a direct reference to ancient divination rituals, a way of communicating that Caesar was acting not out of personal ambition, but as an instrument of divine destiny. This message was instantly understood by all who knew the esoteric codes of the time. The civil war that followed was not simply a military conflict between Caesar and Pompey. It was a battle between two completely different visions of Rome and power. Pompey represented the Republican tradition, based on ancient institutions and laws. Caesar represented something new and revolutionary, the concept that a man could transcend ordinary human limitations and become a living embodiment of divine will. Caesar's victories in this war cannot be explained solely by tactical superiority or troop loyalty. He possessed an almost hypnotic ability to inspire absolute fanaticism in his soldiers and inflict inexplicable demoralization on his enemies. Contemporary witnesses describe Caesar's soldiers fighting with a supernatural fury, as if possessed by divine forces. On the other hand, entire armies of Pompey sometimes fled without a fight, seized by an irrational terror they could not explain. When Caesar finally entered Rome as dictator for life, he wasn't content with simply being the Republic's most powerful ruler. He initiated a complete transformation of Roman society, implementing reforms that seemed impossible by the standards of the time. The Julian calendar, which he introduced, wasn't just a practical matter of temporal organization. It was a way to synchronize Roman life with cosmic cycles he had studied in ancient Egyptian texts. The public works Caesar ordered, the games he sponsored, the spectacles he organized all followed esoteric patterns designed to keep the Roman people in a state of permanent fascination. He understood that true political power came not just from controlling institutions, but from controlling the collective imagination. And he was a master at this art. But the most disturbing aspect of Caesar's power was his ability to turn enemies into allies through techniques that can only be described as sophisticated brainwashing. Men who had sworn to destroy him often became his most loyal supporters after a single private conversation with the dictator. There are no detailed records of these conversations, but the results were too consistent to be coincidental. Caesar had mastered something we would now call mental programming. He knew how to identify anyone's psychological vulnerabilities and how to use those vulnerabilities to completely rebuild an individual's loyalty and convictions. It was a form of mind control that left no physical scars, but was more effective than any form of coercion or torture. The conspiracy that would eventually result in Caesar's assassination did not arise by chance. A group of senators began to realize that Caesar was not just an ambitious dictator, but something far more dangerous. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that he possessed knowledge and capabilities that posed an existential threat not only to the Roman Republic, but to the very nature of human civilization. Brutus, the most famous of the conspirators, did not betray Caesar out of mere political ambition. He was carefully manipulated by other senators who knew exactly how to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities. The irony is that the conspirators themselves used variations of the same techniques against Caesar that he had employed to control others. Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March was not merely a desperate political act. It was an attempt to destroy knowledge the conspirators considered too dangerous to exist. They hoped that with Caesar's death, the secrets would die with him, but they were mistaken. Caesar had been too careful to allow such valuable knowledge to disappear with his death. He had trained disciples, created secret schools, and established networks of initiates who would ensure the continuity of his work. Mark Antony and later Augustus were not only Caesar's political successors, they were also the continuators of his esoteric tradition. The Roman Empire that emerged from the ashes of the Republic was not simply a natural political evolution. It was the result of the systematic application of the knowledge Caesar had mastered, now implemented on an even larger scale by his initiated successors. Augustus, in particular, took the techniques of mind control and social manipulation to levels of sophistication unmatched. Until modern times, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that lasted more than 2 centuries, was not maintained solely by military force. It was the result of a system of social control so sophisticated that most people didn't even realize they were being controlled. The people of the empire not only obeyed Roman laws, they internalized them, making them part of their deepest identity. The games at the Colosseum, the public baths, the religious festivals, all of these were part of an integrated system of psychological conditioning that kept the population content and submissive. It wasn't casual entertainment. It was social engineering applied with scientific precision. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Caesar's legacy is how this knowledge survived the fall of the Roman Empire itself. When Rome finally collapsed, the esoteric techniques that had been developed and refined over centuries did not disappear. They were preserved and transmitted through secret organizations that continued to operate in the shadows throughout the Middle Ages and into modern times. The early Catholic Church, in particular, incorporated many of these techniques into its own practices. The ritual of the Mass, the architecture of cathedrals, the hierarchical organization of the clergy all followed principles that traced directly back to esoteric knowledge preserved since the time of Caesar. It is no coincidence that the Church managed to exert almost absolute control over the European mind for over 1,000 years. During the Renaissance, as ancient texts were rediscovered and studied, some scholars began to understand the true nature of the power that men like Caesar had wielded. Secret societies such as the Bavarian Illuminati and later Freemasonry were created specifically to preserve and develop this ancient knowledge. The French Revolution was not just a spontaneous popular uprising. It was carefully orchestrated by men who had studied the techniques of social manipulation. Developed in Imperial Rome, Robespierre and his associates knew precisely how to use propaganda, symbolism, and psychological terror to transform an entire nation in a short period of time. Napoleon Bonaparte, emerging from the revolutionary chaos, was perhaps the first European leader since Caesar to fully master these ancient techniques. His ability to inspire fanatical loyalty, his genius for manipulating public opinion, his almost supernatural ability to turn defeat into victory through force of personality all directly echoed the methods Caesar had employed 2,000 years earlier. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, this knowledge was systematized and developed by thinkers such as Gustave Le Bon, who wrote on crowd psychology, and Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, who practically invented the modern public relations industry. They weren't simply creating new techniques, they were codifying and perfecting methods that dated back to ancient times. 20th century totalitarian regimes, both fascist and communist, applied these techniques on an industrial scale. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao all carefully studied the methods of social control that had been developed over millennia and implemented them using modern technology. The result was forms of psychological domination more complete and effective than anything Caesar could have imagined. But perhaps even more disturbing is realizing how these same techniques continue to be used today, in more subtle but equally effective ways. The advertising industry, social media algorithms, political marketing techniques, all of these are direct evolutions of methods initially developed in the secret temples of ancient Egypt and perfected by men like Julius Caesar. When you see an advertising campaign that manages to make millions of people desire a product they didn't even know they needed, you're seeing a modern application of the same principles Caesar used to make soldiers march joyfully to their deaths. When you observe how certain political figures manage to maintain loyal followers, even when their contradictions are obvious, you're seeing the same mind-programming techniques that were used to transform Roman citizens into obedient subjects. The difference is that today these techniques are applied more diffusely and less visibly. Instead of a single charismatic dictator controlling an empire, we have a complex network of corporations, media, and political institutions working together to shape collective consciousness. The result is a form of social control that is simultaneously more subtle and more pervasive than anything that existed in the past. What makes this situation even more worrying is that most people are unaware that they are being manipulated. They sincerely believe that their opinions, desires, and even their identities are the product of free choice and independent reflection. They don't realize that they are reacting to stimuli carefully designed by people who have studied the vulnerabilities of the human mind for centuries. The secrets that made Caesar powerful didn't die with him. They evolved, became more sophisticated, and spread. Today, anyone with internet access can learn basic techniques of persuasion and influence that would have been considered esoteric knowledge in antiquity. But the true masters of these arts continue to operate in the shadows. using their knowledge to shape entire societies according to their own purposes. The question we should ask ourselves is not whether these techniques exist or whether they are effective. The historical evidence is too clear to deny. The real question is, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we protect ourselves from manipulation when the methods have become so sophisticated that they are nearly impossible to detect? Perhaps the first line of defense is simply awareness. When we understand how these techniques work, when we recognize the patterns, when we question our own reactions and motivations, we become more difficult to manipulate. Not impossible, but more difficult. The second line of defense is genuine, critical thinking, not just questioning information that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs, but especially questioning information that confirms what we already want to believe. The most skilled manipulators don't try to change our opinions directly. They reinforce our biases so that we become more extreme and less able to see alternative perspectives. The third line of defense is genuine historical literacy. When we understand how power worked in the past, when we study the techniques used to control previous societies, we become better able to recognize when those same techniques are being applied in our own time. But perhaps the most important defense is simply intellectual humility, recognizing that our understanding of reality is always limited and partial, accepting that we may be mistaken about things we take for granted, keeping an open mind to evidence that contradicts our deepest convictions. The story of Julius Caesar and the 4,000-year-old secrets that made his rise possible is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning about the nature of power and how it can be wielded in ways that transcend our common understanding. It is a reminder that human freedom is more fragile than we like to admit, and that its preservation requires constant vigilance. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he wasn't just defying Roman law, he was demonstrating that a man with sufficient knowledge of human nature could transcend all the limitations that normal societies impose on individual power. He proved that it was possible for a single individual to shape the destiny of entire civilizations through the intelligent application of psychological techniques. This lesson was not lost. Over the following centuries, other men studied Caesar's methods and refined them. The result is that today we live in a world where true power is rarely exercised in obvious or direct ways. Instead, it operates through the subtle manipulation of perception, the gradual conditioning of behavior, and the careful engineering of social consensus. The final question each of us must ask is, are we willing to accept this reality, or will we do something to change it? Do we have the courage to face uncomfortable truths about how our society really works? Are we prepared to take responsibility for thinking for ourselves, even when it's difficult and sometimes painful? The answers to these questions will determine not only our own fate, but the future of human freedom. Because if there's one thing Caesar's story teaches us, it's that knowledge is power, and those who possess knowledge will always have an advantage over those who prefer to remain ignorant. The only question is whether we will use this knowledge to free ourselves, or whether we will allow others to use it to control us. The 4,000-year-old secret behind Julius Caesar's rise isn't just ancient history, it's a key to understanding our present world and perhaps to building a better future. But only if we have the courage to use it.